Mr. Lenthal in the affirmative. Mr. Crespo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just, to explain my vote, want to commend the sponsor of this bill for bringing forward a very important solution to a very real problem, and that is that if anybody in this room really believes that we need to end all forms of discrimination, and in order to ensure the proper delivery of service to all New Yorkers, we need to have the demographic data to ensure that we're tracking the success of many of the initiatives that we champion in our House and in our budget through policy or the budget. A lot of times we talk about diversity and we talk about the importance of caring for all, but without this data, we cannot ascertain whether or not we're successful in those efforts or whether we need to do more. And this bill and the solution presented by Assemblymember Kim will allow us to do that as it relates to a growing population, the Asian American, who have differences that go beyond just language, but go into culture and other very real issues of health and quality of life and other things. So I commend the sponsor and vote in the affirmative.
Mr. Crespo in the affirmative. Ms. Peoples-Stokes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me, excuse me, to explain my vote. I want to join my colleague Crespo and Lenthal in commending Mr. Kim for just having the wherewithal, the wisdom, and the vision to begin a process that's very, very necessary. There are a lot of other ethnicities in this country who have at one point had to start a process that will begin collecting the data and looking in a positive way towards their ethnicity, and I think it's his turn to do this, and I am commending him for doing so. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my request and vote in the affirmative.
Ms. Peoples-Stokes in the affirmative. Mr. Leonardis.
I too rise to explain my vote and add my voice to my colleagues in commending Assemblymember Kim for introducing this piece of legislation. When I represented all immigrant New Yorkers in the city of New York for 5 years, the mission then, in terms of government, in that case, city government, as it is a mission here for the state government, is to ensure that all New Yorkers, regardless of their background or regardless of their status, have access to information and services. And that is a mandate that we have in ensuring the safety of all New Yorkers. This bill highlights the need to make this available and continue to have the commitment of government to ensure that no one stays behind because of information or because of inability to access the services that we have available to all New Yorkers. The safety and well-being of all New Yorkers relies on that, and I think this is a step in the right direction, and I vote on the affirmative on this piece of legislation.
Mr. Ramos in the affirmative. Mr. Ramos.
I also join my colleagues to commend Mr. Kim on this legislation. Data is really important. Many times we have different groups in this state and in this country that claim different disparities, and unless we have the data, it's very difficult to identify it. So I commend Mr. Kim for representing a large portion of his constituent and bringing to light the fact that we need to be able to look into it and see if there are in fact any disparities. What really surprises me is the idea and the mentality that if we are doing other groups a disservice, then we should do a disservice to the Asian community as well. If we're not collecting this data on any other group, we're doing wrong by them, we should do that to the Asian community. I certainly welcome that all ethnic groups be studied to really identify where those disparities are. A democracy is a work in progress. And perhaps right now, 100% of every ethnic group is not, data is not compiled. But Mr. Kim has added another brick to that building of justice to be able to attend to all communities, and I commend you. Thank you.
Mr. Ramos in the affirmative. Mr. Hevesi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to commend the sponsor of this bill. We have a problem. Social service delivery in New York State is unequal. There is a population that doesn't have access to basic services. The solution is to find out what this population needs and provide it. And when you're talking services, you're talking homelessness, you're talking domestic violence, and particularly with this population, unfortunately, you're talking human trafficking. We are going to look back at this vote one day, and we're going to say to ourselves, this was the gateway to a new drive for this population to get the social services that every other American deserves and demands. I'm proud of this vote, and I'm proud of the sponsor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Hevesy in the affirmative. Mr. Levine.
Roosevelt used to talk about the concept of Americanism, and he used to say, for the immigrants who come here, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what your religion is, doesn't matter what country your parents or grandparents came from. As long as you believe in America, you're an American. And I think that that's the heart and soul of American exceptionalism. Of course, my colleagues on the far left deny that there's anything exceptional about America, and on the far right, they say it's divine providence. Of course, the divinity is their own particular conception of divinity. But essentially, we're all in this together. And Ron Kim, thank you for pushing this bill forward and getting it passed. How else are we going to reach communities that otherwise could remain hidden? We see on a worldwide basis the danger of nations that do not believe in assimilation. We see the chaos and the hostility that flows. This is a major step in the right direction. As someone who came from an immigrant home, I am very pleased to be able to vote for this. And again, sincere thanks.
Mr. Levine in the affirmative. Mr. Mosley.
Mr. Speaker, to explain my vote, early this week, Assemblyman Kim had the duty of bringing me back from New York City, where we spoke at a symposium on race relations, particularly as it relates to or within the Asian American community. And we talked about, in particular, what we were doing in the state legislature to build those bridges. And I'm just so proud of my colleague for introducing this legislation, and more importantly, for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who are supporting this legislation, because we know that this is one of the fastest growing groups and populations, not only in his district, in my district, but in the state and in this country. And it's only appropriate that we create data in an effort to address their needs and issues as it relates to them being citizens of our great state and our country. So I want to commend my colleague for introducing this legislation, and I vote in the affirmative.
Mr. Sepulveda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, rise to commend the sponsor, my colleague, Mr. Kim, for this bill. You know, I have a very diverse community, and I brought many of the members of the community here to the chamber. I have a large Southeast Asian population, Southwest Asian population, and our goal in life in this chamber is to provide services to everyone. If we have 192 countries and we ever have the resources to provide these services to people who come from these countries, then that should be our goal. And we shouldn't be critical if a particular group who's been historically underserved in this country needs assistance, and this data will get them to get resources. A lot of people in our districts, in my district, who come from these communities do not get services because they don't have information, do not get services because the government doesn't have the information to be able to provide the needs that these communities have. And so I commend the Speaker, I commend Mr. Kim for a job well done, and I know that this will be a roadmap for not only the Asian community, for other communities that come to this country. I withdraw my request and vote proudly in the affirmative.
In the affirmative, Mr. Sepulveda. Ms. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to also lend my voice to the support for Mr. Kim in his courageous introduction of this very important piece of legislation. One thing that I know is we are in a fight for equity, fairness, justice, diversity, and inclusion at many different levels of our service from state agencies. And we know that this type of documentation will give us the background information and the evidence when we're saying that equity, fairness, and justice isn't being afforded to all people. It is through the utilization of this type of information that we were able to find in looking at a report, Workforce in the State of New York, that of the 150,393 jobs in state agencies, only 5,000 of those jobs are for people who are of Asian descent. We see that that is a disparity. We know that these types of things exist, and it is through this type of documentation that we will be able to put forth the type of fight that we need to make sure that we bring those numbers more into the movement of fairness. So again, thank you for introducing this important piece of legislation. I stand with you in making sure that the goals of this legislation gets realized, and also putting forth all of these efforts as we move for fairness, justice, and equity across the state of New York. So I vote in the affirmative. Thank you.
Ms. Walker in the affirmative. Ms. Bashat.
Yeah, I rise in support of this bill. I want to commend the sponsor, Mr. Kim, for introducing this bill that tracks demographic information on immigrant population that has been probably quite ignored for some time. When we ignore communities, they do not have access to resources that are available to them, and this bill will allow to give those access. I know this for a fact because I serve a large Caribbean immigrant community, and during the census, we were tremendously undercounted. And as a result of being undercounted, for every person that was not counted, that was $30,000 not allocated to my particular district for over 10 years. So we have a community of immigrants who are just not getting the resources that they should be getting. So I certainly commend, again, Mr. Kim for bringing this. This will serve as a model for different communities, different immigrant communities such as mine. They say that Haitians in the state of New York or the city of New York, there's only 100,000. That is ridiculous. We are all over the place. We are in Rockland County, Long Island, 5 boroughs of New York City. But because we are reported so low, we are not getting the services that we need. We are not respected. And so this bill will serve as a model for many other populations, immigrant populations, and I certainly want to thank you for that. And I'm going to be working with Mr. Kim to promote this bill and also to work on a similar bill for our greater Caribbean immigrant community. Thank you. And I'm in the affirmative.
Ms. Bashat in the affirmative. Mr. Montesano.
Thank you. Just on my vote, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to vote in the affirmative for this bill, being one of the co-sponsors of it. I'd like to thank Mr. Kim for bringing this bill forward. Even in my district, we have a lot of diversity, a lot of different people from different communities who have settled in, and information like this is very helpful to help on all levels of the services that'll be provided and delivered and even considered on a county level, town level, and on a state level. So I'll be voting in the affirmative. Thank you.
Mr. Montesano in the affirmative. Mr. Kim to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 years ago, when I was first, 3.5 years now? Yeah, 3.5 years ago, when I was first elected, I had a constituent by the name of Mr. Ding, who is an 82-year-old gentleman, came to my office. He had cataracts. He couldn't really hear well. He had a walker with no family. But he was in a unique situation because he was living with 3 other roommates in a 1-bedroom apartment, barely getting by, looking for services. But it was an apartment that was illegally converted, and there were other seniors who were living with me of Asian descent who were not getting the services that they needed. That gentleman would get up every single day, get on the casino bus to go to wherever the bus is taking him, sell the voucher in the backhand to make a few dollars to make up his rent every month. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of other seniors like that around the state who are not properly accounted for and whose problems are not being properly addressed. And I hope that this legislation will resolve that. And furthermore, there's also an intangible impact that we're resolving with this bill, which is the model minority myth that many Asian Americans face. Not every Asian person in the state lives on Park Avenue and went to Harvard and got a PhD from Yale. There are, again, 1 out of 4 Asians in New York City live in poverty. 1 out of 4 senior Asian Americans live in poverty. 1 out of 6 Asian Americans live in poverty in the city of New York, and they deserve to be heard. So with that, I withdraw my request and vote in the affirmative. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Kim in the affirmative. Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 120, noes 10.
The bill is passed.
Assembly Number 39A, Calendar 3, Mr. Simonowitz, an act to amend the Vehicle and Traffic Law.
Read the last section.
This act shall take effect on the 90th day.
Clerk will record the vote. Help me. Help me. Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 107, noes 15.
The bill is passed. Right, please. Please.
Assembly Number 504, Calendar 390. Mr. Cusick, concurrent resolution of the Senate and Assembly proposing the amendment to Section 1 of Article 2 of the Constitution.
An explanation is requested, Mr. Cusick.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. This bill would amend the state constitution to allow 17-year-olds who will be 18 by the time of the general election to vote in presidential primaries. As we know, there are presidential primaries happening right now, and it is an important part of the presidential electoral process, and we want to give the opportunity to young people who want to vote to not only vote in the general, but vote in the primary if they're eligible in the general election, so that they are part of the entire process that takes place. And I just want to point out to my colleagues, this does not apply for this year or this year's primary. So if anybody has that question, I want to get out there ahead of it. This will have to pass in the next session in order for this to happen. Thank you.
Mr. McKevitt?
Yes. Will the sponsor yield for a few questions, please?
Will you yield, Mr. Cusick?
Absolutely.
He yields.
You note that we have a presidential primary coming up, but
Do we?
in actuality, you may have just read about it a couple of times. April 19th this year. But we actually have primaries every single year, whether it's just, for a local races or state races. So I'm just wondering why you do this for only the presidential election, but not the other primaries, which we have every single year in the state.
Well, again, we're starting with the presidential primaries. One, because there is a high turnout of voters in a presidential primary. We find that young people get excited when it comes to the presidential primaries. So we felt that the primary process is also spread out. Usually this year, as you pointed out, the New York primary is in April and the election is in November, whereas in a regular election, it's September, or if we had our way, June, but September to November. So we wanted to start in the presidential primaries for the young people who want to go out and vote.
Okay. So it's not because you feel that president's more important office than others, only because there's general interest in that election more than the other elections.
Yes, and also, too, there's precedent. There are other states that do it in presidential elections. There are over 20 states that already have this process. It was challenged in Ohio recently, and a federal court approved in favor of this process. So this is, we wanted to do the same here in New York.
You make also an interesting point about when the primary date takes place, and just some interesting on the logistics of this. Currently in New York State, if you are 17, you're allowed to, I guess, essentially pre-register to vote, being that your registration is not effective until you turn 18 on that election day.
That is correct.
What makes it a little bit different with this is that election day is always going to be the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November.
Right.
Whether it's here or in 2031 or in 2200, it'll always be the same date. New York has a constantly changing primary date. As a matter of fact, this primary date of April 19th was only rather recently selected as April 19th. Some years it's March, some years it's later. And my concern is how are going the logistics with the Board of Elections figure this out when election day is always a constant, the primaries change, could be radically from cycle to cycle.
Well, again, as you said, it's logistics that I'm confident that the Board of Elections will be able to implement this. Again, to put in shameless plugs, there are a lot of bills on the calendar for updating the way we run elections and election day, including electronic poll books and other things that would streamline the process for identifying voters as they come in and as they register. I am confident that the Board of Elections can do the logistics on this.
You may have that confidence in the Board of Elections. I do not have that confidence in the Board of Elections. I'll give you one recent example. Recently, the New York City Board of Elections sent out a notice to 60,000 new registrants in the city of New York, telling them the primary date is going to be September 28th of 2016. It's actually September 13th. So it's an agency that can't even get right the date of the primary. Now they're going to have to go through thousands of registrations to determine whether they're going to be 17 on the primary date or not. So again, I have a lack of confidence, which we are just going to disagree on, I suppose.
I'm an optimist. I think they
Okay.
can pull it off.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McKevitt.
Record the vote. Ms. Lipton to explain her vote.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, to explain my vote, and I want to commend the sponsor for this very important bill. You know, one of the things I've heard over the years is that we have high school seniors who've been studying government, and they're very interested and excited in politics and government and voting, and sometimes they don't get the chance to vote, and then they go off to college. They're often 17. They turn 18 sometime in their senior year or after their senior year. They go off to college, and we don't always encourage college students to vote, unfortunately, and they don't know where to vote. They don't know. They feel a little homeless, and we often don't put voting booths on college campuses and other things like that. So I think it's very important to draw the students in early, get them excited, get them voting, and hopefully build a lifelong habit of voting, which, of course, we all want everyone to do. So, again, I commend the sponsor and vote in the affirmative on this important legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Lipton in the affirmative. Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to commend the sponsor on this incredible bill, a necessary bill. You think about recently in Ohio, a judge actually just ruled in favor of this kind of change to allow 17-year-olds to participate in the process. It led to an increase in the participation. You look at what's been happening in other caucuses. The Iowa caucus is an example, similar positive example. So it's something that makes a lot of sense, and it will definitely increase voter participation, which is exactly what we should be doing across the state. So I just want to commend the sponsor for the bill, and definitely will be voting in the affirmative. Thank you.
Mr. Blake in the affirmative. Ms. Peoples-Stokes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to explain my vote. I think this is a very good piece of legislation. It's very timely, and I believe that there will be young people in high schools and even some freshmen in college who will be very excited about the opportunity to know that in New York State, we are actually encouraging people to vote, as opposed to as is happening in some other states, Mr. Speaker, where folks are being discouraged from voting. So I am very pleased to vote for this piece of legislation. I will commend the sponsor, remove my request, and vote in the affirmative.